you can either call it the end, the climax, the denouement, or the escape route. So whatever. So today it's going to be a little bit packed. We have a lot to cover. We have demonetization, exit, and this. So demonetization and the meta challenges are in this year's survey. Exit is in last year's survey, and I would urge all of you to read that, because these are chapters which I think have been well received, and also these I think are express some new ideas about the Indian economy that we were very excited to do. Now, I'm going to begin with demonetization, and I know that this is a very topical, a very issue that all of us have strong views on. But on this particular module, I would urge you to completely suspend your views and your opinions, because I think what is really important about this, and this is what we did in the survey, was to see, how do you analyze this completely unprecedented action? I mean, what data should you use? How should you analyze it? And also, how do you teach this? So I think demonetization, because it was for us a kind of great learning and opportunity, I think you should see it both as a learning, but of course more as a teaching opportunity. In terms of data, in terms of history, in terms of analytics, in terms of short term, in terms of long run. So it's not finally about, so today I want, on this module, no one's opinion, because I'm not going to give you my opinion. I want no one's opinion on demonetization. I know you have strong opinions, but please put yourself in the, eyes and position of the students you're going to teach, and see how we can take them through this, because it really is a fabulous experience for learning. So with that in mind, let's start demonetization. I mean, obviously the place to start is this.
देश को भ्रष्टाचार और काले धन रूपी दिमक से मुक्त कराने के लिए एक और सख्त कदम उठाना जरूरी हो गया है। आज मध्यरात्रि यानी 8 नवंबर 2016 की रात्रि को 12 बजे से वर्तमान में जारी 500 रुपए और 1000 रुपए के करेंसी नोट लीगल टेंडर नहीं रहेंगे, यानी ये मुद्राएं कानूनन अमान्य होगी।
Okay, so really dramatic and high, powered announcement. I mean, it can be delivered by no more important a person. So on the 8th of November, India decided to, or the government of India decided to, make the 500 and 1,000 rupee note, they ceased to be legal tender, except for a few purposes. And roughly 86% of cash in circulation, and the total cash at that time was 17.7 lakh crores, was rendered invalid, and these had to be deposited into the banks. Yeah. Yeah. Now it's okay. So the first thing we did in the survey was that, if we made some assumptions and said, if all this goes through, what would be, what would happen to cash in circulation, a currency with the public, and what would it be historically? So straight away you can see that this is probably a fairly, dramatic, unprecedented action, because it tells you that the growth in currency probably, would never be as low as it would be after demonetization, and of course it would also be a sharp decline, although what you see here is that if you look at it historically, there have been other episodes of sharper declines as well, but in terms of the level of growth, this is probably among. So straight away, I think what, if I were teaching this thing, I would immediately ask your students and say, what happened in these other episodes? What happened? And how do you compare it with this episode would be something that you would, so fairly unprecedented. The other thing which is very interesting about this is that, remember, in history there have been demonetizations. And so in the appendix to the chapter, we compiled all the well, not all, as many as we could get data on, but you broadly find two patterns to demonetization. One, you get sudden demonetizations, but all of them have been in the context of some kind of social or political or economic upheaval. It could be in the context of hyperinflation, it could be in the context of political change, it could be in the context of war. Then on the other hand, we've had slow and gradual demonetizations. Many countries have done, phased out, Singapore, Europe phased out its 5,000 euro coin. Many countries have done it, but they've done it gradually. So you've had sudden demonetizations along with upheaval, gradual demonetizations, but the Indian experiment was unique. It's the only sudden demonetization in very normal circumstances. There was no hyperinflation, no war, no conflict, nothing. And so that was what was in some sense historically quite special about the Indian demonetization. Now, so of course there were cash shortages for some time. So what were the objectives? I think the Prime Minister, when he read it out, he said explicitly there were 4 objectives, to prevent the curve of black money, corruption, currency counterfeiting, and of course high denomination notes being used for terrorist activities. But I think in some ways I would argue that underlying all this, or maybe going beyond this, what I think demonetization was it was meant to signal a regime shift in terms of how much the government would tolerate, illicit activities and activities that led to tax non-compliance. So think of demonetization as signaling a regime shift over and above all these specific activities or objectives that the government was trying to achieve. Now, black money, of course, was supposed to be rendered useless. Now, you have to ask, what is black money? And I think we often get confused by this. I think there are many ways of splicing this. Black money, you can distinguish between, origin, its nature, and, the function that money performs. So money performs transactions function and a store of value function. And in each of these, you can get white money or black money. So for example, a company pays employee salary in cash, it's declared to the authorities, it's white money. But the same thing, if an enterprise pays in cash, but they don't declare it to the authorities, then it becomes black. Another thing to keep in mind, of course, is that transactions can inherently be, supposing you had, one more column and said money laundering, by definition, that would be black money. So you can have black money from illicit transactions, smuggling, counterfeiting, etc. But you can also have black money created by transactions that are legal, but then it doesn't lead to tax compliance. So that's similarly store of value. When households keep declared savings in cash for emergency, that's white. But then if a businessman hoards undeclared cash, say he wants to use it for election time, that's black money. So distinguish between what the transaction is for, what the origin is, what the nature is, and whether it's an inherently illicit transaction or it's a completely legal transaction which is then declared or undeclared. Now, what is the background to the deal? Yes, question, only question. Yeah, please.
Money which circulates in Roscars, informal Roscars, would be classified as
Informal? No, if that money is declared, it's legal. If it's not declared, if it's earned and not declared for tax purposes, it's illegal. So it's very, I mean, just think about how the money is generated. Is it an illegal activity or a legal activity? And has it been declared or not declared? So that's the way to think about this. So what is the background to this? The background to this is, first you look at cash to GDP around the world. And this is a chart which shows, cash to GDP on the y-axis, a country's per capita GDP on the x-axis. And you do find that India is relatively high. Its cash to GDP was around 12.5%. And you can see it's at the upper end of the chart. And certainly for countries at comparable levels of development in the middle of the pack, India is quite high. So there is a sense in which India's cash to GDP ratio, there was a lot of cash in the economy. So these are just, these are just lines of best fit for low income, middle income, and high income countries. Now, yeah.
Are these countries having the similar kind of banking system like India, or is it not?
This is just a first cast. You can go and check that. We haven't controlled for the level of type of banking system they have. Yeah. So, but this is just a chart which shows we know that India is high. It's high for its level of development. Whether it's high or low, depending on the banking system, you should go and check. But that's a good question. Yeah. Then you find this is some private data. What percentage of consumer transactions are carried out in cash? And India is amongst the highest in the world, both in terms of volume and value. This is a Price Waterhouse study. The interesting thing, of course, is that also the cash to GDP ratio in India has been rising. Can we convert this into a pen? It's a pen? So it's really interesting that, in the first 20, 30 years after independence, the cash to GDP declined. But what you find, this is blue's real GDP growth. This is cash as a percentage of nominal GDP. You find that cash to GDP has been steadily rising. And then this is an interesting period. This was the high inflation period. So when inflation was high, cash came down. But once inflation was kind of conquered again, we're back to a rising cash to GDP. So essentially, the long-term trend is that we have a high and rising cash to GDP ratio over time. And within that, you see that the high denomination notes, HDN, that's 500 and 1,000. Of course, they will vary over time. At different periods of time, the high denomination notes may be different. But you see high denomination notes becoming a higher share of nominal GDP. So both cash is increasing, but high denomination notes are also increasing. And this is a comparison of the highest denomination note as a share of GDP per capita of the country, which tries to estimate. So, if the high denomination note is very high relative to GDP per capita, then it's less likely that it's being used for transaction, more likely that it's being used for store of value. And India somewhere here is in the middle of the pack. So you can't really make out whether India is using, it's predominantly be using for transaction or for storing value. So in this survey, many people have come out with estimates of black money. There were 3 reports submitted to the government some time ago. You have to distinguish between what percentage of the economy is black. That's one set of questions. The other set of questions is how much of the money in circulation was actually not being used for transactions purposes and was being stored maybe illegally. And you can make these assumptions based on, how quickly the note deteriorates. For example, I think we replace our 10 rupee notes, every 3 years because they deteriorate very rapidly. So the Reserve Bank actually has data on all these denominations, how rapidly they deteriorate. They're called the soil rates. So you can make assumptions on, how much do you think the 500 and 1,000 should deteriorate relative to the 10 and 50 and 100? and you can come up with estimates of what black money should be. One assumption yielded 7.3 lakh crores. In the survey, we revised some assumptions. It's something that if you want to know more about in greater detail, you can contact us. On another assumption, one estimate was that it was 3 lakh crores, or about 2% of GDP. Now, so now we get into the broader analytics of demonetization. What was demonetization all about? I think that I'm going to show you a table, but there's one thing for those who study monetary economics should and teach macro and monetary economics should keep in mind, which is something very, very unique about the Indian demonetization, is that, you see, you think basically what happens is that the supply of money has basically come down in one shot. But the interesting thing is something that I also learned as I went along. You see, remember when you think about money, cash is money, the deposit you put in the bank is also money. So, so has all money come down because of demonetization? No. In this case, what happened was that one particular form of money, which is cash, came down. And the interesting thing is that, look, so if you look at growth in average currency and total money, this is total money. But what you see is that this is a very unusual experiment in which cash came down dramatically, and intrinsic to this, not separate, because this came down, this went up dramatically, because this cash had to be deposited in the bank. So this is it's not like, you know, a money contraction like has happened in the past. It's not like money expansion like all the central banks have done in the recent past. It is a particular form of money change where one form of money declines very rapidly and another form increases very rapidly. So in the survey, you know, we call this the helicopter Hoover, because, you know, helicopter drop was what happens when you put money into circulation. But if you suck out money, we called it, I mean, just as an aside. But this is a very unusual. So straight away, for all of you who are thinking about money and the impact of money on the economy, you have to then see, oh, if this has happened, then a lot is going to depend upon how substitutable cash and other forms of money are in transactions. So this is a very important point. So it's not all money has come down, one form of money has come down. To the extent that, you know, you can substitute away from that using other forms of money, then maybe the impact will be less. If you can substitute less, then the impact will be more. So it's a very unusual kind of monetary shock or experiment, as it were. It's also tax on unaccounted private wealth maintained in the form of cash. So essentially people who had black money and kept it in 500 and 1,000 would lose some of it if it was black money. But if they laundered it, in any case, they would have to pay taxes on it, because they would have to you know, declare how they got it. And this is the process that is ongoing now. And of course, it's also tax on savings outside the formal financial system. So you could think of demonetization as forcing people to cover illicit savings into financial savings as well. So these are all aspects of demonetization. And so we have, you know, there's a table in the survey which goes through each of the, you know, impossible impacts in the short run, in the long run. And, you know, you could think about many things. For example, interest rates, for example, I'll show you a chart. Because deposits increased into the banking system, interest rates came down. How they will recover depends upon how much money comes back. Formalization, digitalization, I'll show you, will probably go up in the long run. Wealth depends upon whether people can launder it or not launder it. Real estate, given that a lot of money is in real estate, should those prices decline? I'm going to show you what we did on GDP. And also we think that tax collections will actually go up over time because more of the economy is going to be formalized.
Can you go to the last slide, sir?
Just
It is on the assumption that,
Please.
sir, there is a RBI balance sheet will shrink. It is on the assumption that the full money is not collected.
You see that if it declares outstanding notes will no longer be redeemed.
That's okay.
Yeah, but also depending on how much came back.
Yeah.
So you had a question, sir?
Actually, cash is going down, deposits are increasing, right?
Yeah.
So to what extent it explains the kind of the existence of black money in the economy?
Meaning, could you
Meaning that all that cash is, that is being deposited into the banks.
Yeah, no, but you see, but in some sense, see, remember that if it had previously been declared, then there's no problem. It's just white becoming white. But previously, if it had not been declared, then black has to become white. So that's the way I think one should think about this. So similarly, there are many impacts, and I'm going to take you through some of them. So, for example, in this survey, we did this around January, and so we had 2-3 months of high-frequency data. Did in fact digital transactions go up? And we categorized it into 3: the digitally excluded, who basically do digital transactions through Aadhaar. Then there are the more affluent people who have credit cards and debit cards. And then we have less affluent customers who use RuPay cards. What happened to them? So again here, it's less important whether it went up or went down, but to think about how you should think even about digitalization. Because digitalization, there are at least 3 categories of people who can be, digital haves and have-nots, and digital kind of intermediates. Some who don't have phones at all, they would be digital have-nots. Some who have iPhones, smartphones, they will be affluent customers, and others who may not have smartphones but who may still have regular phones, or who may have RuPay debit cards. So we analyzed what happened to all kinds of digital transactions.
Sorry to ask so many questions, but this, if you will include the recent week's data, the things are declining drastically.
This is where I want to come back to this. I said, don't look at the direction. If you want to go back and update the data, please go ahead and do that. We will also update the data when we produce a survey. But here we're not talking about good, bad. We're talking about how to analyze it.
One simple question.
Yeah. Question.
Yeah.
So-
Can I have the mic? Thank you. Yeah. The question is something that was previously asked, and it is regarding the helicopter Hoover effect that you were talking about. If cash is declining and DD is rising, then black money being converted into white, the speed at which it is happening, and the whole idea about demonetization attacking black money was that a lot of this money would not come back to the system. But if it comes back to the system, then what happens to black money?
So that's why I want to impress upon you the fact, maybe I'm not making myself clear, is that when we think about black money, that has either been generated through illicit means, or it's been generated but tax has not been paid on that. So when it comes into the formal system, if it was previously white, it's now white. If it was previously black, black has become white, either in the form of declaring it or in the form of now taxes will have to be paid on that. So that's the way to think about this.
Laundering?
So I mean, laundering, see, remember, that's a good question. Laundering should be thought of as in the following way. Basically, to convert black to white, that's laundering, right? But the person who had the black maybe paid a cost to have it laundered. So it's still a tax on private wealth, because he had to pay to launder it. But previously, he didn't have to pay to hold that. Now, in order to convert it to white, he had to pay a cost. So in that sense, the action was a tax on private wealth. Yeah. Okay.
Sir, do you have the latest figures for these three
I,
factors?
I have told you that this is your job in class. Please go tomorrow. First thing you do is get your students to update this chart.
Sir, because we are reading the news in the
Yeah, that's
newspaper.
please go ahead and read it. As I said, I don't want your views on this.
It's not views, sir.
I don't want
to
your
get the
views.
facts.
I said I don't
It's
want your
not
views.
Trying to get the latest.
The latest data, volume 2 of the survey will have this. When we're going to update,
Up to May.
we will update it, and we will. So in July, when we bring out volume 2, a special copy will be flown to all of you, and you can open it and say what happened in May and June. Until then, no opinions, just questions.
Sir, with demonetization, how you were explaining how people are actually converting black money into white, do we see a rise in agriculture incomes or in trust money or Hyundai money?
It's a good question, but we haven't done that analysis. I mean, it's this chapter in the survey was well received because it was the first place where we put together a lot of evidence on this. But obviously, there's much more that can be done. Yeah. So we looked at we looked at real estate. What happens after May? I don't know, sir. You go and check it. Okay. I'm just telling you what we did. Given the data that we had then, there were signs that real estate prices did come down. Now, okay, sorry, question. Can we come back to your class? The downward trend started. Yeah. So here that's a good point. Remember that when I present a chart like this, very good point that because remember. This is demonetization is somewhere here, I think. And so there was a downward trend, the blip, and this kind of, you could either see this as a continuation or a trend or a reversal of the trend here. And it could be either. And that's why we need more data. And my friends from Kerala, where real estate is so important to the fortunes, all the Gulf money comes in and boosts up real estate. Let's see what happens afterwards. Yeah. Okay. So now, if you go to the table, for example, you'll see a kind of not exhaustive but a fairly comprehensive listing of all the possible things in the short run and in the long run. By the way, there's a famous quote attributed to an American politician who used to say, "Ladies and gentlemen, you're entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to your facts." So I think first look at the facts and then form the opinions. Yeah. Anyway, so here's how to think. We thought about what the short-term macroeconomic impact is going to be. Remember that one of the things that the survey had to do was to assess the short-term macroeconomic impact. And so conceptually, again, thinking like macroeconomists and monetary economists, how should you think about demonetization? One, it's an aggregate demand shock, primarily, because it reduces the supply of money and private wealth. Remember, private wealth can be reduced in 3 ways. Just to summarize the questions, private wealth can be reduced in 3 ways. 1, it doesn't come back into the system, they've lost it. 2, they've laundered it, but they paid a price to launder it, right? For example, if you want your, all your drivers, you had 1 lakh, you want to distribute it amongst 5 drivers. If the drivers were smart, they would say, we'll do it, but commission chahiye humko, commission chahiye, and that's the loss to the owner. And the third is when the wealth comes in, you have to pay taxes on it. So aggregate demand shock that reduces the supply of money and private wealth. It's an aggregate supply shock also to the extent that cash is an input to production. For example, this happened during the sowing season, and if you have to pay cash to laborers to then presumably it could have an impact. If you can't pay cash, you can't hire labor, you can't have output. So it's also an aggregate supply shock. And of course, it's also an uncertainty shock. We don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how policy is going to respond. You don't know, so there's a lot of uncertainty both for investors and consumers, which could affect their spending decisions. Now, one thing we said very clearly in the survey, as the last point that's getting hidden, is that in all this, the impact on the informal sector would be very difficult to measure because we don't actually have data. You may have data on bits and pieces on the informal sector, but getting an impact on the informal sector on a macroeconomic basis. I mean, you could say in Tirupur this happened, in Surat this happened, but what happened at an all India level on the on the informal sector was very difficult, continues to be very difficult because we don't have data on this. Now, so what are the indicators we looked at? Again, please go ahead and update it. We looked at, for example, what happened to agricultural sowing? Was that affected? What happened to indirect taxes? Because remember, some people thought that activity would come down and taxes would slow down. But what happened was, to some extent, part of laundering involved having to declare it and having to pay more taxes. So to some extent, so you don't know which effect outweighs which effect. Then we monitored, for example, one informal proxy for the informal sector demand was, the two-wheeler sales. Two-wheeler sales came down very sharply. So that was an indication that maybe informal sector demand had come down. And then of course we monitored real credit growth, what was happening to the economy. And of course these are just some indicators. You could monitor a lot of indicators to see what was happening. But this was what we did in terms of seeing the very, very short run impact of demonetization, because between November and January, we had about 2 to 2.5 months of data, and that's what we had to do. But then we also had to come up with a GDP forecast for the economy as a whole. And there, of course, again, this is very simple and very crude, but here I'm going to drop names here. So as we were doing this, exercise of how do you estimate the impact, you could do it in very sophisticated ways, you could do it in simple ways. So essentially what we did was, we said, look, MV equals PY, simple quantity theory of money. What we're going to do is that to estimate the impact of on P and Y, we're going to see what's going to happen to M, we're going to make some assumptions about V, and then we are going to figure out what PY is going to be. Now, okay. So I think we had to do two conceptual issues here to operationalize this equation. Remember I said cash and money. How will it behave? I mean, if cash comes down, deposit goes up, is it the sum that matters? Or no, because they're not fully substitutable, actually individually they matter. So you need a separate analysis of the two. And of course, you have to make assumptions about the formal and informal economy. Because in principle, again, analytically, to be sharp and stark, essentially you could think of, if you have a formal economy and an informal economy, the informal economy will be affected by this, and the formal economy in principle should not be, because it doesn't depend on cash, it's mostly credit and so on, or other forms of money. So how do you, bring these two in? So we had to make some assumptions about, first, what would be the reduction in M? Second, what part of the economy fraction was formal, how much was informal, and how this would work itself through that equation MV equals PY. Now, let me drop names. So while I was doing this, Paul Krugman was here for a day. So, I had breakfast with him, and he's an expert on this and many other things. So we had a chat, and he asked me, how's demonetization going? And I asked him, if you were in my position, how would you do this? How would you estimate the impact on GDP? And he pretty much said essentially exactly this, that you have to do M, you have to make some assumptions about formal and informal, you may have to make some assumptions about velocity V, and then do some robustness checks. What if it goes down? What if the substitutability is half, not 1? And do various kinds of robustness analysis. But basically, this is a kind of it's fairly crude. It's not too sophisticated, but in the short time that we had, and given that we didn't have these very sophisticated models, this is what we did. Estimate M, how much is formal, how much is informal. The informal sector is relatively less affected. Informal sector will be affected more. That comprises so much of GDP, therefore aggregate GDP. And at some point, Abhishek here, if you want the spreadsheet on how we did this, Abhishek, we could make this available, right? Okay. Now, but here's the first difficulty. What is M? How do we project M? Because remember, something very interesting was happening, right? When demonetization happened, first, some transactions were still legal even with the old notes, like paying taxes, paying for petroleum, etc., etc. So you have to take that into account. The second thing was that a lot of the new money that was coming in was 2,000 rupee notes that were less liquid. You know, people wanted hundreds and 500s, not 2,000s, and you heard a lot of reports about, you know, 2/3 not being as liquid as, say, the 500 or the 1,000 used to be, because, you know, people said no, nobody's accepting. And remember, in all of this, so much of money is about trust. You know, I take a 2,000 from you if I trust you. I won't take a 2,000 from you if I don't trust you, or if I believe, you know, it's going to be very difficult for me in turn to change that to pay for the smaller transactions that I have. So we had to make a lot of assumptions about this, and we also had to make assumptions about how much digitalization would take place, because the velocity of money, the circulation of money, is also going to be affected by that. So lots of assumptions went in, and remember, my theory of economic analysis is be bold, make the assumption, but be transparent. Most people would say, oh my God, I cannot estimate this, I cannot estimate this, this is very difficult, it's very difficult, therefore I will make no assumption. Or often they will make estimates where they do make assumptions, but not fully transparent about them. So we made assumptions, we said these are our assumptions. And for example, we said this would be the remonetization timeline based on, I mean, this is the impact. So one of the things we showed, for example, was based on our analysis, the currency squeeze was actually greater in December than in November, even though much more money had come into circulation in December, because of the liquidity impact, that 2,000s were not as liquid as something else. So then we made these assumptions, and these were the assumptions that, you know, and again, I'm not saying, again, please go back and tell your students, you know, show this to them and compare it with actuals. I think these are going to be very different from actuals. So tell them, and remember, we put, the red line is our central estimate, and because there's a lot of uncertainty around this, we said you need confidence bands around that, i.e. we're not sure. I mean, we suspect this, but it could go down as much as here, it could go as much as here, because inherently there's a lot of uncertainty in these estimates. So be bold, be transparent, be cautious, and go ahead and do these things. Excel spreadsheet, yeah, we can give you the Excel spreadsheet for this. And then we made these real GDP forecasts. Now, I'm certainly not going to show this to my Kerala friends. They'll say, but actually GDP is this and not this, but you should go. And we were off. Our GDP estimate was off, and you should go and go. No, actually, it was close, actually, was it? No, it was off. 7.1, that's exactly what happened, right? But I think we were right for a completely wrong reason. So, you know, you should go and check it out, and this is what happened. So we also said, you know, there would be a lot of excess liquidity. This chart, red line, is about excess liquidity. So how much more deposits there are in the system than what actually banks want. And you find that even after 7 months, we haven't cleared away the excess liquidity. And one of the monetary consequences of that has been that if you look at short-term rates in the system, what they call the call rate, which is the overnight rate, and the 7-day repo rate, the 91-day treasury bill rate, they're all still either at or below the repo rate, which they should not be. In normal times, the call rate should be equal to the repo rate, and the treasury bill rate should be about 25 basis points higher than the repo rate. But we still have a lot of excess liquidity as a consequence of demonetization. And this is continuing to have macroeconomic effects. I'm showing this to you again because these have macro consequences. And this. So now, one of the things we also said was, look, We said there are going to be short-term costs, and some of which we can't measure because we don't measure the informal economy, but there could be some long-term benefits. And we said that in this case, these long-term benefits are not just nebulous, oh, it is going to, there will be benefit, but we can actually tell you what the markers, what all of you should be monitoring to see if demonetization is delivering these benefits or not. And we said, I'm going to finish and then you can ask questions. And we said that there are at least 3 markers, things, targets that you can monitor. One, are we going to see increased digitalization on a consistent basis? And that's something that we have to monitor. And all of you are clearly monitoring it already. You're monitoring it on a daily basis, which is fantastic. Second is, if the aim was there was too much cash in the system, you must get a reduction in cash in the long run, because after all, if some of it was black, then there should be less of it. So there should be a reduction in cash to GDP ratio, an increase in formal as opposed to informal savings. You should see that. And the last thing we said, of course, was that because, as I said, this is about signaling that there's should be that the government would be less tolerant about tax non-compliance, we said that over time you should see an increase in the number of taxpayers and the tax income. Now, remember, and this is completely, we said that then, we say it now, that when you talk about the markers of success, there are targets, but there's also timing. I mean, how soon should these benefits become evident? Clearly, these are not things that are going to happen overnight. I mean, digitalization, you have to see this increasing on a consistent basis. Yeah, cash to GDP, again, on a long-term basis. Number of income taxpayers, you can't just see a blip 1 year, and if it settles back into the old pattern, then you haven't achieved it. So 2 years from now, 3 years from now, I will come to you, to your classrooms, and see whether you've done this analysis or not. I will be sitting in the audience, you will be delivering this, and I will be saying, but you have made data, but you haven't done it. Why haven't you done it? I will demand of all of you. But this is something that you should do. These are the markers for success. There's a target. There's also time frame for when these things can happen, and that's what we should. So that's how we should, in the medium term. For example, I think putting together another idea. Someone remarked, and I just want to make it public. This is perfect to do all kinds of difference in difference analysis. Exactly. You can say, oh, so we think that, for example, you can see, just to give you one example, right? What happened did the increase in income taxpayers this year, how did it compare with increase in income taxpayers last year between November and before November? So you can do all kinds of interesting analysis to see what the impact is going to be. And I can guarantee you over the next 3 to 5 years, there are going to be many, many PhDs done, hopefully in India, but I know certainly around the world, on the impact of demonetization, because I think it's going to be a very rich subject. Then we also said in this, after all, some actions, how do you maximize the benefits and minimize the costs? And I think that we said a number of things that we should do. For example, one of the things that I was kind of very keen on is that we should bring land and real estate into the GST. And I think we should also try and increase the income tax, reduce maybe the corporate tax rate. And also, there's a big concern that demonetization might lead to a raid raj, going after taxpayers, and we have to be careful that while we, try and, pursue cases where we think, there is black money involved, we should also be careful that it doesn't become a free-for-all trawling exercise where the tax department goes and, goes after all and sundry, because that can have a very chilling effect on the economy. That can also create a lot of harassment for taxpayers, and therefore we should avoid all of this. So, to conclude, a very bold and unprecedented experiment it was a kind of partly a monetary experiment, but partly also a kind of signaling device. It raised a whole lot of analytical issues in terms of how we should understand it and how we should analyze it. And here we've presented what we did in the survey in terms of how we should measure the impact in the short run, in the long run, and trying to put all of this together. What should be the impact on GDP? And this is what we did. And I think that really this is a terrific experiment for teaching and learning. I think it's really, for example, to explain how money works. Now just to give you, to give you just one example, when we saw the first agricultural sowing data that came out after this, remember we said that if it's an aggregate supply shock, then to the extent that you need cash, you may see some decline in agricultural production, but we didn't see that. And so clearly what was happening was that maybe informally credit was being extended given instead of cash. And so so the Indian economy was finding kind of jugaad type mechanisms, ways of getting around this. And so these are all things that I think one should look at, analyze, and study in greater detail in the years to come. Now, questions? Those are, you were waiting for some time, please.
So one is that when we are trying to estimate the impact on money supply, and we are trying to distinguish between the formal and the informal sector, the velocity is also likely to be different for the formal and informal sector because the extent of digitalization, etc., is.
Absolutely, you have to make exactly, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. And so, sorry, but I did not follow how soil rate is actually linked to the estimation of black money. If you could
Yeah, so see, look, supposing you have a 100 rupee note, or let's say take a 50 rupee note, and you make the assumption that's always used for transactions, because you're not going to store cash in 500 rupee notes, you're probably right. You see the soil rate on that. Then you see the soil rate on the 1,000, right? Then you say, look, they can't be identical because obviously by definition the higher thing will circulate less, but you can make some assumptions on looking at data on other countries. The ratio of soiling between high and low denomination notes, apply it to India and see what comes out. So it's a very kind of interesting exercise we can do. Now, the gentleman there has not asked questions, so maybe let's give him the mic.
Sir,
Yeah.
you have shown Robi sowing is increasing, but there is some negative impact on agriculture that you have said already. What is the paradox?
See, let us first, I'm tempted to say, give the stock response, but I guess what you're asking is, remember, this is what we did when we had the data, right? Now you have to update that to what is happening in agriculture today. And therefore we have to see, what is happening. So for example, today, take pulses, for example, or take dairy products. We've had excess supply and prices have come down. So one question is, have the prices come down more because of some demonetization effect or not? So that's something that one should study. Yeah. Yeah, that gentleman there, yeah.
So you have presented an increasing trend in digital products as an impact of demonetization. But even before demonetization, we can see that there's an increasing trend in the use of these digital products. So how we can distinguish between a general trend and a general increasing trend and a trend due to demonetization?
Difference in difference. You can see the trend before and the trend after. Trend before. See, I'm not saying this may continue and that you have to do, but at least at that point in time, the charts speak for themselves. So you just have to look at that carefully, that's all. You're not looking, sir, carefully at the chart. No, my friend has not asked a question at all, so we have to give him a chance. Please.
Sir, what are the major impact on social sector, especially for the health? So, for example, the middle class and poor on the particular time.
My friends, you guys are very, very demanding, you know. It took us 3 months to produce all of this. You want to say what's happened to the social sector, what's happened to environment, what is happening in planet Mars because of demonetization. I think this is, you should go and, no, but I think that, see, look, more seriously, I think, for example, you could look at what happens to incomes in rural areas, and therefore, you know, their ability to this. Now, were these concentrated in some sectors or not? You know, was agriculture more affected? Was informal labor more affected? You know, so these are all things that you should draw out. But you know, we know that the first order impact of this is not going to be on, you know, health or, you know, environment. Those will happen, but those will be second and third round effects, and those are inherently more difficult to quantify. So my friend there hasn't asked a question, and the lady there. Okay, first the gentleman there, and then the lady here. I want to give everyone a chance, because now we're all become such good and close friends. I know who talks and who doesn't talk.
Sir, I have a very simple question.
Huh? Yeah, so far I've been a bad teacher, now I'm becoming a good teacher. Good.
Sir, Professor Arun Kumar of JNU has done a study on the black economy, and he has said that majority of the black income are in the form of assets, and very minority is held in form of cash. So how can the demonetization black money can be correlated?
See, remember that I said that in terms of demonetization and black money, right? Demonetization, at least in that, has 2 dimensions. One, whatever black money is held in the form of cash, you try and get that. And you know, you may say that's very small, maybe that's the case, but you go after that. Second, remember I also said it is a signaling device that all forms of illicit transactions and non-compliance will be punished. Therefore, going forward, the costs of non-compliance will go up. So people then, there should be an impact on people who, even if they hold it in other forms, to have to declare it to a greater extent. I'm not saying that will necessarily happen, but that was the intention.
And we know that GST, I have basically read this, that GST would be a kind of follow-up for the demonetization. So my question is that, as we know that in Indian economy, most of the black money is being hoarded in the form of real estate. So, and in GST, this particular aspect is out of the purview of GST. So how would GST be a follow-up for demonetization of real estate?
See, first of all, you should have been in the GST along with me. Then there have been 2 people shouting for land and real estate, and not just one. But here's the thing, right? GST, how is GST a follow-up to demonetization, right? I would say one very important and successful, and one precisely because of what you said, not as successful. Successful because, remember, with GST, by definition, I spoke about, remember, all the invoice matching that's going to have. You're going to be able to, identify, undisclosed, both indirect tax, but also the information that you get will allow you to track direct taxes as well. So there's evidence around the world that, when VAT systems increase, income tax collections could also potentially increase, because you get the data. If a company is importing 10 BMWs and then the owners don't declare that in their income tax returns, you can actually do these data analytics. So in that sense, it is a natural follow-up to demonetization. The follow-up would have been even better if land and real estate had fully come into GST. Now, so it's disappointing that it fully didn't come into GST, but one aspect of it has come into GST, which is what are called works contract, i.e., if you go and get someone to build your house, those transactions will now be in GST. What will not be in GST is if you buy ready-made property, it won't be under GST, and land transactions per se, if you buy land, those would not be under GST. But my hope is that over time, because unlike alcohol, this is not constitutionally out of the GST. At any point in time, the GST Council could, and in fact, after I wrote that piece on bringing land and real estate, the GST Council, at least one or two of the members raised it and brought it up very strongly, and the finance minister said, this is something that we should be looking at over time. So I've not given up hope on that aspect as well.
Survey shifted from demonetization to e-monetization. E-monetization is cashless, and the pace is very slow. So what is the reason? I think the government must take some measures to increase the e-monetization.
So see, I think that again, it's a nice way of putting it, demonetization to e-monetization. I think if you don't mind, I'll steal that for the future and pass it off as my own, because this gentleman here is trying to pass off the whole course as his own. No, but there, remember that the government has done a lot in terms of the BMAP, incentivizing digital transactions. But in all of this, you have to understand that this is all going to be an ongoing, continuous process. Most people, let me just give you one example. I hope this is a basic statistic that I didn't know. India, 25 crore people have smartphones, 35 have regular phones, crore, and 35 crore have no phones. So they're out of the system. Right? So therefore, and even with regular phones, you can't, it's a limit to how much you can do this. And so many people are in the informal sector. So I think this is a process that's going to take time. But I think this is one agenda that, the Prime Minister and the government are very keen on continuously pushing. And we have to monitor all these things that happen over time. But the BMAP, for example, is one example of where things are beginning to become dynamic. Yeah, accessibility, definitely. The last mile, something that we didn't do, we could do that maybe in subsequent MOOCs. In terms of financial inclusion, the last mile still is a very big problem, as my friend just said. Yeah, I'm going to, we have to do exit, and we have to do, these are my 3 favorite chapters in the last 2 years survey. So I have, for this, I have to talk a lot now. So.
After demonetization, means 7 months has been passed. The striking questions everybody is asking: how many black money has been deposited with RBI? Total deposit, kitni deposit RBI ke paas aayi? And yesterday, our finance minister said that 6 to 8 months. Then we need to calculate how much deposit that we have. So my question is it really difficult to calculate the deposit?
I'm also going to clap. It doesn't deserve an answer. It answers itself, I think. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to. The gentleman here hasn't asked a question for a long time, so he gets a chance. Please, the mic. Thank you.
Sir, I just want to ask a kind of simple question.
Yeah.
In this
My friend,
MV,
no question is too simple, as
yes,
you know. All
MV,
good questions.
MV is equal to PY. You are using this to forecast real GDP.
Okay.
The real GDP slide is based on this MV is equal to PY.
Okay, so that's a really good question. That's a very good question. And I'm glad you asked it, because in principle, we can only forecast P times Y, not Y. And because it's a monetary shock, it's going to have the first impact on nominal GDP, not real GDP. So again, the other set of, so we forecast nominal GDP, and then we made some assumption about how much will be price based on underlying trends and how much would be quantity. Because you would think that nominal GDP would come down, so both prices and quantities would come down. But exactly, very good question.
Very quick one. Just 5 seconds.
Okay, last question. We have to move on, because are we taking a break or not, my friends? Okay, today, because we have too much to cover. Okay.
So whatever little I understand about demonetization, one thing sticks out. Replacing notes is fine. You want to curb black money and solve a host of other issues. why a 2,000 rupee note, which is as, I mean, in terms of transactions value, for the most part of the population, very, very illiquid. So at my level, I had a problem converting. So I can very well imagine the problems that other people much below us in income status.
Yeah.
Any thoughts why the 2,000 denomination? That's all.
Okay, so that's a very good question. Why 2,000 when you're demonetizing even the 1,000? I think that's a great question. I think there are two components to one is I can answer, and one I will, you will have to, future research will have to do this. But essentially that, see, the 2,000, even the 2,000 was quite illiquid in the early stages, but when the smaller denomination notes started coming, it became more liquid. You see, this tells you that money is a lot about confidence and trust. So if you feel that there's a lot of 500 in the system, you're willing to use more than 2,000. You see, because you say, well, I know I can use it because if I don't, if I want a smaller note, I can always get it. But if there are no 500 notes, so the same 2,000 note at one point of time and the 2,000 has very different liquidity properties because of what else is happening, and those are the kinds of assumptions we had to make. Now, why it was introduced when the 1,000 was seen to be a source of black money, I think that's a good question that we will have to, I knew that was your question and I was trying to get to it after a long gap, but that's a good question. I think that, sorry? No, I think there could be political economy. There could have been the thing that, we had to, because to print smaller notes takes longer time than 2,000, so that could have been one reason. And also, because, see, also that before, 2 or 3 years before all of this, the RBI had also recommended a 2,000 and a 5,000 note, so they must have had some logic for that. Okay, so I'm going to move on. No, my friend, my friend, don't you... how can I say no to a politician? How can I say no to a politician, my friend? You'll get me into trouble. Okay.
No. This is an economic class. I am your student.
Okay. But outside?
So I just want this transaction charges, because we have security transaction tax and the commodity transaction tax, something on this banking transaction tax or any transaction charges in the...
Sorry, so what's the question?
This bank transaction tax or any charges on the transactions. We already have security transaction tax, commodity transaction tax.
HDFC has just done it. We already had a lot of taxes on our debit card and credit card paid, especially to gold.
No, I'm talking of the government transaction tax.
Yeah, so
banking transaction tax.
I think you have in mind ideas that are coming from your party, for example. Yes. So I think that. See, I think that I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's a policy question. That why don't we raise more money by using a transactions tax as opposed to other taxes? I think that's kind of part of the question that's been raised in some circles. You see, I think that generally from a tax policy point of view, transaction taxes are quite costly because basically it impedes the smooth circulation of money and the economy, right? Because remember, the number of transactions that take place in an economy is like probably 20 times the GDP or 50 times the GDP. So if you're going to introduce transactions taxes, I mean, you'll get the cascading, like, we went to the GST to avoid cascading. So, and so it kind of will clog up the system and prevent the smooth flow of money. So I think that's why we generally don't, there are some economies that do that, but I think generally the aim is to, so even the securities transactions tax, for example, is not considered a very desirable tax from that point of view. Okay, so I'm going to move on, because we also have to do so this is the exit. So one of the, I call this, remember you want a break? Okay, 10 minutes break. But then, please, so it's 11:08. I'm going to start at 11:22 and 30 seconds. 11:22:30. Two things to cover.